Thanks for the introduction, RJ. Now, I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News, and one of my favorite things to do on the energy transition is to look at numbers and make sense of it. And let me start with the good news, right? This is something perhaps most of you in the audience have now got, which is last year, the total amount of investment that went into clean energy was $1.8 trillion. That which went into fossil fuels is $1.1 trillion. The ratio is starting to grow for clean energy investments versus fossil fuel investments. But as RJ was mentioning, there's still a big gap because we need to make something like $4 trillion of investment in the energy transition on an annual basis. And the biggest gap is in developing countries, a $2.4 trillion annual investment gap. And on the panel today, I have some of the thinkers and doers who are going to be, well, are already moving a big sum of money into developing countries on the clean energy transition, but will also find ways of scaling that up. So I'm going to ask for a few examples of things that you've done. In the meantime, I'm hoping you guys will scan the QR code and get me questions towards the end of the conversation so I can grill them a little more on how to make this gap work. But maybe, Damilola, let's start with you. At SE for All, the name says it all, sustainable energy for all. You have a dual mandate. You have a mandate of getting energy access and making sure that that energy is clean as possible. In doing that, which is not a new desire, we've had that desire for a while, what have you found the most impactful steps that you've taken at SE for making that work?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for having me at this summit. It is really nice to see so many amazing minds coming together to solve key issues. And when we do talk about energy, we keep on talking about the transition, and we tend to forget about access. You were talking about clean energy investment. Unfortunately, only 2% of that money actually went to the African continent. So it's important to put in context where these investments are happening. So with that in mind, one of the things that we try to do is how do you tell countries who are energy poor that they need to transition out of something they don't have? It is really important when you go to my country or the continent I come from, people are like, transition out of what? We do not have this. So we also have the very, very unique opportunity that when people actually grow, they're growing green from the start. I don't think we've ever had that type of opportunity before. So at SE4, we've been spending a lot of time on what we call energy transition and investment plans. And again, I'll use my country as an example because I was working at the highest level of government, and everyone comes in and says, please decarbonize, net zero, you have to stop your oil and gas that's responsible for 95% of your revenue. And they, everyone says everything and then they go away and then they come back and try and get your oil and gas later on, but that's another conversation. And I always said, could you explain to me what you have to do? So what we did was, we help countries plan, what does it look like? So for Nigeria, for example, to get to a point where you have to provide power to 80 million people who don't have power, but also industrialize. How do you do it in the most green, effective way? What happens to your clean cooking sector? What happens to the way you build buildings? What happens to your oil and gas sector? And just what happens in general to the populations when you put the just part of the transition? So for Nigeria to effectively transition by 2060, not 2050, it will cost $1.9 trillion. This is with perfect policy, perfect political transitions, and we always get those. And I just really want to put that in context of people's minds. And this also means a tagline of at least 410 billion above business as usual spending that needs to come from somewhere. So this is data that we equip the governments so they understand what they have to plan for. And a country like Nigeria also understands, what do I have to start investing in now for when the last barrel of oil leaves my country? So it's those type of things we do with our energy transition plans.
And now you've developed these energy transition investment plans, the ETIPs, for a number of countries. Has it started to already unlock investment in any of these countries, or are these plans that now need to become policy and then the investment will come?
Well, there are different stages. In Nigeria, For us to do a plan, first it has to be requested by presidency, and then automatically it has to be approved into policy. That's the condition that we give to go into a country and do a database plan anyway. So as you can imagine, getting people to completely transition is really a green growth factor. So there are about 6 or 7 key policies that have to happen over the last 5 years. But apart from that, what was able to be done, like let's say the World Bank has now put about 3.2 or 3.4 billion, the last, to Nigeria on the back of the fact they have a data plan, on the back of the fact they can show using decentralized energy and their EV plans, which we help them model, this is what we have to do. But these figures are not enough, I must say, but things are happening, but they're just happening in piecemeal.
Now, Avinash, one of the things that you and I have talked about a number of times is, there is a phrase that is used quite often, which is blended finance will unlock the investments in developing countries. Now, blended finance can mean many things, but at the end of the day, what it's trying to do is manage risk to the investor. And risk for an investor sitting here in New York investing in, say, Nigeria, they look at it from sort of a stack perspective, multiple risks. Damilola talked about political risk, there's currency risk, there's execution risk, can you actually build it and build it on time? You've done a lot of work looking at this risk stack, and you found some solutions. Tell us about them.
So I think that we should start off with the number you mentioned at the beginning. One of the things that those of us in this space have been trying to do is to make people understand the scale of the problem. Because until 2 years ago, we had all kinds of wonderful, clever ideas that made their proponents look wonderful and clever, but they were just not scalable. So $2.4 trillion a year ex-China. A lot of stuff is happening in China. Very little is happening outside of China, India, Brazil, in the developing world. And yet the developing world needs to be fully engaged in the energy transition if we're going to preserve our planet. $2.4 trillion. So when I see that number, I also conclude that blended finance is not going to work. There is not enough subsidies in the world to blend $2.4 trillion a year, every year, for the energy transition. So we need to find a way of dealing with this problem without relying on a subsidy. And so we've been looking very closely at what are the obstacles to this money flowing. In 2015, renewables became cheaper than fossil fuels, but the key choke point is finance. And if you look at the fault line of where investments are happening, because they are happening in many places, and where investment is not happening at all, or where it's half happening, the fault line is the cost of capital. So in China and developed countries, cost of capital is low. There is mitigation happening. In developing countries, cost of capital is high. And my final point would be, in looking at the breakdown of this cost of capital, we found, and the reason why cost of capital is so important is renewables are capital intensive. And here's the other kicker for developing countries. So when an investor in the developed world is investing in an oil or gas or a coal facility in a developing country, they know they've got an asset that's going to earn them a foreign currency revenue if they need it. They can export that. When they're investing in a solar farm, how is that capital cost being paid back? By local consumers of the utility company in local currency. So when the investors then go to the banks and try to hedge their currency risk, they find that hedging costs makes the project prohibitively expensive. And that hedging cost is 3 or 4 times project risk. All the energy on de-risking in the world is about how do I reduce project risk, sector risk. It's the FX risk, actually. There's about 10 percentage points to 20 percentage points in many countries. So we just launched a platform with the Brazil, we being the Inter-American Development Bank, with the government of Brazil, $5.4 billion. It's a platform, it says to projects, we're going to unpack this risk. We're going to make half of this risk, which is sort of a real hedge, and other half the IDB is going to help out with. The real hedge is projects on the platform have to be able to raise their prices with local inflation. Maybe not every month, maybe not every year, but over time, they have to be able to adjust. That's a real edge. And then we're saying that the governments we work with have to have macro stability. So the real exchange rate we're now dealing with is stable, it's not forever declining. And then we come in and say, at extreme points, we will offer you the liquidity, the counter-cyclical liquidity that a AAA-rated development bank can offer you. Right. So we've unpacked this risk, and we've reduced the need for FX hedging costs for renewable energy investments.
Now, a couple of things that would be helpful to understand. One, I should perhaps acknowledge, last year, we talked about this just as an idea on paper.
Yes.
And now it's real, and there's $1 billion fund behind it. So that's cool, right? We are getting solutions being deployed quickly. But it is complicated. So maybe let's break it down a little bit, right? Cost of capital, just interest rates. Now, do you think now with developed countries where they are on interest rates, where the Fed has interest rates of 4% and plus, is that still cheaper compared to a developing country? One. Then when you explain liquidity issues and issues around what is a real currency exchange, can you break those down so that we can understand what exactly is the innovation that you've brought here?
Okay, so US interest rates going up, that's a major impact for 10 years after the global financial crisis, and during COVID, US interest rates were near zero. The US is like the T-bill for the world. So all of the rest of the world's interest rates are sort of added on top. So yes, US interest rates have gone up. That has not reduced the difference between developing country interest rates and the US. That's actually widened it. The spreads we often used to say when I was a banker that in a rising rate environment, you had rising spreads. So it becomes even more costly, and the money is not flowing. There's all this optimism about the mitigation, but there's not a lot of money flowing to developing countries. And then how are we dealing with this? So take the Brazilian real. Over the last 20 years, in nominal terms, so cash terms, it's fallen by about 30 to 40% against the US dollar. In real terms, inflation adjusted, it's actually been stable. It's not fallen. So I need to convert this risk into a real risk and deal with the cycles around it. How do I do that? I make sure the project can raise the prices. I make sure the government's got stable macro policies. It's got an independent central bank with an inflation target, and we will deal with the extreme points.
Now, Sumela, you've been around since 2007, the Africa Finance Corporation.
He's still a young
man. And you've invested in a number of projects around the needs of African countries. Increasingly, you're investing in clean energy projects. Could you talk us through maybe one or two examples, and what were the challenges you faced, and what have you learned from that, and what can the investor community help you with?
Thank you for that. So I think the first way to look at this is the fact that Africa, has about 39% of the renewable energy potential of the world. It has about 10,000 gigawatts of the solar capacity of the world, has about 110 gigawatts of the wind capacity, 350 gigawatts of hydro capacity, and about 15 gigawatts of geothermal capacity. But I think apart from, I would say, maybe the gas, powered systems, where we have about 10% of the, actually, it's not even 10%, it's more like 5% of the capacity. Everywhere else is 1, 2, 3% of the capacity. And if we are going to get to net zero, there is no way we get there without Africa. Because Africa can unlock an additional 350 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity between now and 2030. So what we've done is to look at energy access. Because like Damilola mentioned, for most Africans, energy transition is moving from firewood, which is the most basic form of energy systems used for cooking, to anything less polluting. So that's what we have. And in a lot of African countries, so for example, Nigeria, which is really a gas country with some oil, energy transition will be more practical there, if you use gas systems. I know it's not a very popular topic, but it's just reality. So going to renewable energy systems is going to cost, like she mentioned, $1.9 trillion. But if you try to go through energy transition with natural gas, it's about $500 billion. So it's more scalable. What we have done is to really focus on energy access for Africa, energy affordability for Africa, because the cost of capital, like we know, it's very high. So, for example, US interest rates about 5.5. In Africa, if it's cheap, it's 9%. Mainly it's 12, 13, 14, 15%. So how do you finance energy systems with such high costs? What we've tried to do is to look at what is the requirement of a country and what is the best source of energy for that. So we've always known that renewable energy systems were cheaper on a long-term basis because most energy systems rely on fossil fuel, which has a high cost because it has to be imported in the main, and in some cases it has to be developed at a high cost, and that development cost is not available. So we've tried to focus on how can we use renewable energy. So we did the first renewable energy project in Cape Verde. It's a small island country. We built a plant that provides 20% of the energy requirement, and we discovered how long it took for people to get comfortable with the risk in Africa. And what we decided to do was, on the next project where we're trying to build an independent power plant that was hydro-based, we decided to introduce what we call a construction finance equity bridge instrument. The idea being to increase, the chance of success or reduce the completion execution risk for the project. So we find that because Africa is perceived to be so risky, even though it's not true, the stats tells us that the only place that's less risky than Africa with lower default rates is the Middle East. Africa is still priced much higher risk. So instead of just spending time and convincing people about projects, we said, okay, look, why don't we build the projects so that people are not concerned whether the project will happen or not, but they will have the cash flows of the project to diligence to ensure that there will be repayment. So we introduced that instrument, and it helped reduce the time for development. And we did that again for Djibouti, which was also the first independent power plant in the country. And there, of course, we know Djibouti is a small country, and they actually have aspirations to use most of their renewable energy sources for the energy they have. So we work on a project to replace imported energy from Ethiopia and diesel generators with renewable energy, and we built a wind farm. There, again, we introduced the construction finance equity bridge instrument. Started with first a partnership with the government, 90% for us, 10% for them. And then we developed the project. We got the MIGA, World Bank, MIGA, provide political risk insurance. And then we approached FMO to come and develop the project with us after we had de-risked the project to a reasonable level. And they came on board, and then they invited climate investors to work alongside them, and we reduced from 90% to 51%. And then we used the construction bridge to construct the plant, because wind farms are reliable technology now. So we work with Siemens out of Germany to do that. So we're able to deliver the project at a faster period because of that construction finance instrument. So what we've learned is that the way to scale projects in Africa is to first take the initial steps for the development, to de-risk the opportunity, and then find partners that you can work with to provide a construction finance instrument that allows you construct the plant and reduce the risk of completion, reduce the risk of execution. Make the investment in the transmission capacity that will absorb the energy, because that's a big challenge. The capacity to absorb the energy is always a challenge, so make that investment. Also, train the people, train the teams to understand how to run the systems, and also work with the communities. So, for example, on this project, we built a water desalination plant so that the community will have, drinking water, be part of the system, be part of the solution of the development of the people. Make the project not just about providing energy, but transfer impact to the people. And we did that. Also, in this case, we had to consider migratory birds, because it's at the route where there are lots of birds flying, so we have to space the wind farms to avoid obstruction. So, in summary, capital for de-risking, capital to scale, and partnerships with the government,
Yeah.
and partnerships with other institutions to help scale the financing.
Now, one of the things you mentioned, which is having skills training for local places where this might be the first of a kind wind plant being built, but that's just the starting point. You want to build more. The other one we talked about is many of these ideas do sound good on paper, because in theory, renewables are cheaper. We want clean energy. Clean energy is distributed. Wouldn't it be a win-win-win to get it deployed? Often, once it's on paper, getting it actually working is hard. Now, Damilola, one of the things around distributed energy that's always come up is microgrids. How can we use clean energy that's distributed and also solve the problem of energy access, so solve a twofer? That's been an idea for a long time now, but at SE4All, you're now finding success at scale. Talk us through a few examples of how you've made mini-grids and distributed energy work.
Well, I think, the data speaks for itself. There's at least 500 million people that can be connected to distributed energy. And please, I want to correct the thinking of distributed energy as some little solar lantern or something that you give somebody and all of a sudden you said you transformed their life. That isn't what we're talking about. That it's enough energy to live productively. It's enough energy to have productive uses. I want to separate that because we are pursuing mini grids and high-capacity standalone system doesn't mean that you do not need a grid. Mm-hmm. Okay, because sometimes people think it's the way out. You still need the integrity of your grid system to work. And when, Somaliland, we talk about renewables not being cheapest in Africa, it's typically because of the lack of the grid. In a great grid system where you can just plug in the renewables and everything works, it will be cheaper. But when in some situations you have no grid, you're building out that transmission, distribution, and last mile. So that's on the grid side. In terms of the mini grids, we've seen quite a few successes now. I think there's probably about 100 million customers now connected to mini grids solutions globally. We've seen a default to payment rate of, less than 6%. Which is back to Somalia's and this perceived risk factor now. And then we've also seen the evolution of what I call the interconnected mini-grid. So for the first time in the recent years, we're now seeing what happens when the grid gets there. And that's super exciting to me because you still need the backbone. You still need these communities where they might have started off as villages, but they're now growing into like towns. So you do need more energy. So you're seeing the relationship between the utility and the mini-grid developers, and you're seeing a lot of more franchising going on, which we would probably never have dreamt of like 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was like you have an isolated mini-grid. But now with planning, you're seeing mini-grids developing and part of the ecosystem, of the utility. It doesn't work perfectly all the time, There are situations where, in some communities, you build your mini-grid and your capacity is already run out in 2-3 months, right? So we're now seeing a lot of energy efficiency coming in. How do you deal with a lot of agricultural equipment? You have to build a separate system from them. And that modeling work is truly exciting because people are paying for it. And these are people who have been basically living with very harmful petrol and diesel gensets for many years. So it's not just a last mile connection now, we're seeing it in even some urban areas.
And you put out a report around mini grids frequently, and now these are in 100 plus countries. Where have you seen most success? Is it just large populations, or are there other factors that make the deployment of mini grids and then eventual connection to grids successful?
I mean, the two most successful countries is India and Nigeria. And I also think it's also linked to higher disposable income as well. And then very, very strong policy direction from governments. Everybody down to the local government area takes part in it, and it's really planned as part of the ecosystem of the electrification work. So in Nigeria now, there's a new $750 million facility to top up the grants for mini grids. I think what we need to how hopefully what we will get to in the next 5 years is how do we make this truly sustainable? Because like was said, if we continue just this kind of grant culture and this subsidizing culture, we will get into issues that we have in the global north, trying to remove subsidies. Yeah. And I think that's the next phase for mini grids and decentralized solutions.
And Avinash, going back to the idea around risk stack and how do you attack that problem, you're working with Brazil, but the one idea that, to understand risk is if you spread it out across multiple developing countries, that risk becomes easier to manage because you're spreading that risk out. How are you looking at scaling this idea around the currency exchange risk with Brazil, but applying it to other economies?
Well, when we first discussed the idea about 9 months ago, the original idea was a platform with multiple countries and regions because you could diversify the risk. As a key way of managing risk is diversification. But the Brazilians came with the idea and said, we'd like to do this. So you don't say no. And we started off with Brazil, and I think people need a pilot, an example, especially when you're doing something that's a bit different. But it will certainly benefit from being broader. We can, at the Inter-American Development Bank, are looking at broadening out across the region. I'm presenting the idea to the G20 finance ministers tomorrow, and we're hoping that it will become adopted by the G20 and be taken up regionally. And so
G21.
G21, and so with the African Union now being a member of the G20. But as we were chatting with Tasmala before, maybe we can partner with the African Finance Corporation and others because we need to do this. There is no pathway to save the planet without this happening across the developing world. In particular, the large, big, fast-growing developing countries. About 7 developing countries, which if we can get the transition happening there, accelerated there first, it will give us the best chances. It has to be everywhere in the long run, but if it got there first, it will give us the best chance to preserve the planet.
What are those 7?
Well, I think India is number one, and India's doing, so India's cost of capital is sort of in an intermediate level, and a fair amount's happening locally after a big subsidy. But even then, if India keeps at this pace, it may hit some of its 2050 targets, but that's not really a target for the world. And so India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa, those are some of the big countries we need to transition quickly.
And Samela, now you have $12 billion in total invested assets, about $1 billion plus in clean energy assets. You could absorb a lot more money to invest. What is it that you have to do to try and get more people investing in EFC and thus the projects? Because every dollar you invest multiplies into multiple dollars from the private industry.
So what we've tried to do is to demonstrate the viability of the African proposition. And we've done that by first developing to de-risk the opportunities and demonstrating that it works. So we have some that are very successful, some that are challenging. So far, no failures yet, but we have some that are challenging. And what we try to do is to constantly demonstrate what is possible. And so we have moved from just the 3 assets that we own. We work with partners to acquire the largest renewable asset on the continent, which was a business called Lekela. It had 1 gigawatt of wind and solar assets in Egypt, Senegal, and South Africa. And we've acquired that now. We're merging our assets together, and that is going to have the skill that is required to grow. And we think that initiatives like that is what will lead to more growth. So on the back of that, we got an order to build 10 gigawatts of solar and wind in Egypt. We're also looking at other projects that will actually consider exporting renewable energy sources from Africa into Europe, because we always argued that for energy transition to happen, the investment in renewable energy has to happen in global south, not the global north, where they already have significant energy systems. We're also focused on how to process the minerals and metals that are abundant in Africa for the energy transition. So we're looking at the battery value mineral chain. and how to have that process in Africa. So for example, we are invested in a manganese mine that exports to China, where most of the renewable energy capacity exists, especially for batteries. And what we're doing is to put in place a smelter that would transform the manganese into intermediate components for battery use and other components. And it will be easier and cheaper to ship, from Africa to Europe, India, Asia, and Latin America, as opposed to the current cycle now where you're exporting all of the output to China, 40 shipments a year, and then from China, another 3,000 miles to China, 400 kilometers to a processing plant, and it's just heating and crushing, and then you can reduce that output from 40 shipments to just 6 shipments that can be shipped to various parts of the world. So those initiatives are what we think will be required for us to achieve energy transition at scale in the world, and we're open to partnerships. Most people see Africa as an aid or charity case, and it's not. If we're serious about the energy transition, we have to look at Africa as an investment proposition, and we have demonstrated that that is possible. So we're looking and open for partners to work with.
Right, great. Now, we have a number of really good questions, but we only have about 7 minutes left, so we're going to do a quick fire round here. Starting with Avinash, should we be optimistic or pessimistic about the pace of change in the reform of multilateral development banks? We are talking in the week when the spring meetings are happening. You're going to be going to DC and talking about some of these ideas. How are you feeling?
Multilateral development banks need to be 3 times bigger than they are today. It's lending about 3 times more, primarily in climate adaptation and resilience. That process has started with them sweating their balance sheets a little bit more. It also needs new capital. It needs the main shareholders, which are the big countries. The US is the biggest shareholder, to be putting in collectively about $10 billion a year for the next 10 years. Very doable. We've spent around $200 billion on Ukraine, $10 billion a year to transform global finance, to make the development banks 3 times bigger, and that will solve our adaptation resilience problem. Solve inverted commas, it's a big problem, but that will deal with that problem. Am I optimistic? It's happening, but we need to keep pressures up.
Right. Damilola, have efforts to de-risk and aggregate deals improved the appeal of investing in renewable energy projects in emerging markets? So you combine projects that make it, for especially large investors who are looking to invest hundreds of millions of dollars, easier. Is that happening?
Well, I'm seeing that happening more in the mini-grid spaces now, where you find, before we had 100 to 120 developers, and now there's kind of aggregations of sites that are currently going on, but it's not happening fast enough because that's what people are interested in funding. But the other aspect that I think is really important is the way capital is coming in now. So we're a big advocate that a lot of these projects have to be done by local currency financing, because if you don't, you can't really turn around to someone and say, sorry, I'm going to increase your energy bill by 20x because of the devaluation of the naira. It just doesn't work, So we think, some projects are failing not because there was anything wrong with the project, but the way it was financed was wrong. And for that, the role of guarantees play a huge role in terms of the enhancement of that. So I think that there's a few building blocks going on, but the role of guarantees and the whole role of local currency financing to fund renewable projects are key.
But can I just say on that, the pace we need, that's very important. It's necessary. But the pace and scale of investment we need will outstrip domestic savings. So we must deepen domestic markets, but we need about $1 trillion of foreign investment to flow in to developing countries.
So you've already answered a question that was there. Why don't you use local debt? There you go. So local debt has its limits. It is good to use local debt because it's in the local currency. By
definition, investment is going to exceed savings.
Yeah. And Somela, a question around special purpose vehicles. So one example I can pick up, there's one of the ideas is around advanced market commitments. So we've seen in a number of sectors now increasingly. Initially it was in a small sector in carbon removal where a number of companies came out and said, we would like carbon removal to be something that we'd want to fund. We'd want to buy those credits. We're going to pay really big, large sums, $1,000 a ton in many cases. But that allowed for many companies to get going. This is now starting to happen in other sectors. It's happening in green steel, for example. Do you see these kind of special purpose vehicles, these advanced market commitments, say in battery production in Africa, playing a role in funding the transition in emerging markets?
Definitely, any idea or initiative like this can work. What is important is let's see a pilot. Let's come together to see what we're trying to solve for. And then we can look at all the elements of it and try to make it work. So in terms of carbon credits, and that's what really this is talking about, we think that that is one of the tools to finance the energy transition. It's just that the carbon credits need to be viable. They need to be focused on not just, the accounting of it, but really how to keep the trees in the ground to absorb the carbon dioxides, keep the peatlands, so focus on really what is the objective, which is carbon removal, and you must incentivize the communities to keep the trees, give them alternative livelihoods so that they can maintain the trees and do something else, as opposed to just buy carbon credits that really are not related to a system for conserving and regenerating the forests.
Right.
Sorry, on that note, I'd like to come in terms of carbon credits. We also have to create a market where the Global South can actually play in fairly. Today, we don't even have a viable methodology of the displacement of petrol and diesel generating sets. We just don't have it because it's not something that happens anywhere else but a particular part of the world. And then we should also push the carbon conversation beyond forestry. This can be an energy access tool. We're living in the world where the 5th largest cause of death for an African woman is not having access to clean cooking. You can do that through carbon credits. So I think the conversation has to change, and people have to know that when we're talking about carbon credits for the Global South, it's carbon credits or carbon market for development. It's not just a nice to have to offset with companies.
But while carbon markets may work, especially domestic compliance carbon markets are important, the voluntary carbon market will not work because it's voluntary. Today, the size of the voluntary carbon credit market, of all of this talk, $2 billion, of which $1 billion is in India alone. So $1 billion, and we need $2.4 trillion a year.
Now, one last question. We've got a minute left. Avinash, what is the way to repurpose fossil fuel subsidies to help with many of these blended finance instruments? Because if you're thinking subsidies can't do it, well, there are still a lot of subsidies being given in developing countries to fossil fuels.
But it's too simple a view that basically we just switch these subsidies. A lot of these subsidies are not designed to be fossil fuel subsidies. They're subsidies to deal with inequality and poverty. There's a lot of energy poor people. Right. So we need to find a way of repurposing the support we're giving to the poorest and lowest income people. And when we do that, we find that the amount that we can switch is not as much as that. But certainly, where it's not about an income issue and a poverty issue, we need to switch that as much as possible.
Well, I've been following this space for a while, and I will say that we've gone from a place where we only talked about problems to now talking about problems that come with solutions that are being deployed, and that's a very good place to be. Thank you for your contributions.
Thank you.